Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Busboys and Poets presentation of the book Desire. We're so glad that you all could join us. We're going to be hearing from both of the authors of Desire today. Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. So the two authors of the book are going to be joining us today. Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mersey, who is a licensed psychologist and an ASEX certified sex therapist, who owns a virtual private practice specializing in sex and relationship therapy in a suburb of Minneapolis, and can be found on Instagram at Dr. Lauren Fogel-Mersey. And then Dr. Jennifer Benzel, who is an assistant professor, a board certified clinical health psychologist, and an ASEX certified sex therapist. She provides integrated sexual health care at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester and sits on the editorial board of the International Journal of Sexual Health and Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. This is an amazing book, and I'm really excited to hear from both of these authors discussing the way that they wrote it and what they did together. If any of you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat, and I will be asking them later towards the end of the conversation. So welcome so much, doctors. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Nathan. It's so great to be here.
Happy to be here. So it looks like we're going to do a little bit of a chat about this book and in particular our process. So we were chatting a little before this and thinking that maybe we should talk about its genesis and sort of where we first sort of originated the idea. So shall we chat a little bit about 5 or 6 years ago? We're not exactly sure at this point.
It's been a journey, that is for sure.
Yeah.
And this journey really started with you and kind of a brainchild, and I think both of us recognizing a big need in the field of sexual health and sex education.
Yeah. It's something that I was realizing as I was working as a sex therapist that, there's the number one sort of concern that people bring to us is often around desire concerns, whether it's desire discrepancy or low libido. And that most of the books that are written that we were recommending to our clients have been, focused on cisgender women. And that's, a really important demographic, and we need those books. But I constantly kept kind of coming up empty-handed when it came to cis men, when it came to trans and non-binary folks, and also when it came to books that spoke to higher libido cis women, because the narratives were often assuming that the cis women were like the lower libido partner in their cis het relationships. And so I was just like, this book is not out there. It needs to be. And I don't know how long it's going to take. So it needs to get written.
We have some wonderful books in the field, and if anyone in the audience works in the field of sexual health, there's some really groundbreaking books out there that focus on cisgender, heterosexual women's struggles with libido. And yet those were not nearly all of the folks that we were seeing in our therapy offices struggling with some type or form of libido. And really recognizing very quickly that there was not a resource. There were very few things that Lauren and I could recommend to folks that didn't kind of fall into that narrow demographic. So we actually ended up meeting for dinner as we do periodically and did periodically as friends and colleagues, both being in the Twin Cities, Minnesota area. This was, we think, 5-6 years ago at this point, and kind of got to, complaining a little bit about this, like, where do you go? What things do you send to clients or patients in therapy that really need these resources? And both of us were coming up empty-handed on that. Lauren kind of looked at me, as I recall, and said, maybe we should write this book.
I came to you with this sort of tall order to take basically your precious, weekends and evenings and free time and dedicate some of it to this long-term project that felt like an undertaking on top of, busy schedules that we have. But the mission has always felt so important, which was being able to have a resource that we could offer to the folks we serve and folks who don't have maybe access to seeing us, that, we could say, hey, here's a way to sort of pick our brains on this topic and have access to some of what we consider some of the foundational information that we like to share early on with our clients. So I was not expecting that you would say yes right away, or that you would have to think about it, but you were on board, from the start, and that was amazing.
Yeah, and I think I freely acknowledged that at the time. I was like, "Yes, I'm all in, like, this is amazing, I'm behind the mission." We know all too well that not everyone has access to a sex therapist that has good training and background, and, like, there's just not that many of us in the world, much less here in the United States, and so accessibility is an issue. And, right, sometimes people don't need sex therapy or don't need to be paying money or spending time to see a professional if sometimes what they just need is education and normalization of what their concerns are. Um, and so, fully believing in the mission of this book, though I will say, I think at first I was like, yeah, I'm in, and I'm not sure I really conceptualized like what that yes meant at the time.
No
What
idea.
exactly I was saying yes to. I have no regrets, but yeah, we have learned so much in the last few years in this process.
It's a process to bring a book into the world, and we knew that, but we didn't know it. And it's one of those things that you just can't know until you have the lived experience to back it up. Yeah.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had this idea, I, had some notes written down with some ideas of like what we would want to include. And then, kind of met, I think, periodically to just gather some of the books that are out there and do a little bit of um, research to kind of see what do we want to bring from some of the existing, research and literature. But I would say that we didn't really hit the ground running until about 2020, when we were trying to pitch this book to publishers and the world stopped.
Yeah.
And so that was a time where it was like, yeah, nobody's buying books and the publishing industry is at a halt and everybody's in lockdown, and it was just really, uncertain at the time. So there's been some stop and go along the 5 to 6 years that we've been working on this, and it wasn't until I think 2021 that we sort of in earnest really started to work on this, consistently, and really get the writing done. Between then and 2022, I would say.
Yeah.
While we were still working, we live in the Twin Cities. We were working virtually. We were, on video calls with sharing screens and Google Docs and trying to make this
Learning
work.
technology.
Yeah. Trying to write a book from two different places while living in the same city.
Yeah, this really is in many ways such a pandemic book in that sense. We were 20 minutes away from each other physically, but working almost entirely on this book virtually through screen sharing mechanisms of various kinds,
Yeah.
um, which in retrospect feels truly remarkable. At the time, it was just kind of what we had to do, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it really came to be during some of the, most sort of at home distant,
Mhm.
people were doing online learning, and everything was like a Zoom or online space. And so that's how this got written, was in the height of all of that.
Which also gave us a lot to think about because folks may remember at the time, there were news stories coming out about people are like having lots of great sexual activity and increased libido with their partners because they're working from home and they just see each other more, right? Like the grind of daily living has changed drastically in the quarantine period. But also on the opposite end of that spectrum, hearing all of the stories and all of the media kind of sharing, we're seeing people break up, we're seeing people divorce because some of the problems, which included libido differences and challenges, they've really come to a head in this quarantine period. And so we're seeing relationships dissolve over this as well. So I'm very mindful that kind of cultural narrative was going on in the background as we were working on Desire.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't recall exactly what I know they were doing research on how the pandemic impacted partners and sexual frequency. I don't know that there's a lot that we have on quality. And I can't recall all the specifics, but I do remember when they had all these sort of popular press articles coming out talking about how, like, oh, it's going to be a baby boom and everybody's going to be having all this sex and it's going to be just like wild. And I was just thinking to myself, like, absolutely not. I mean, absolutely for some, but
Mhm.
also to make that sort of broad, sort of sweeping statement really is, part of why we wrote this book, because maybe that's an assumption you would make, and maybe that's something you would assume across all people. But I'm over here thinking, like, wow, all the people who um, have stress negatively impact their desire, this is not creating a boom. This is creating a bust. And I think that they did sort of find that there was a baby bust over the past few years. And, stress can be part of it. We talk a lot in the book about how, stress, anxiety, mental health, relationships, it all can impact your level of desire. And so, not surprisingly, a global pandemic is maybe not the best thing for everyone's libido.
Yeah. So one of the original kind of conceptualizations of desire was to think about this as kind of an encyclopedia of libido or an encyclopedia of desire, to really kind of put everything that we could think of into this book that could impact sexual desire or libido. And I think readers probably will still see a sense of that kind of original conceptualization, although things certainly shifted over time and during the writing process, as they do for everyone, I think. So it's moved into something I think much more robust and something I think will be a lot more helpful to readers, where we are certainly cataloging and going into detail about all of the many, many factors that can impact libido positively or negatively, but also providing really clear kind of scripts about how you might talk about this with a partner or partners. Really thinking about kind of self reflection exercises that might help you have a better understanding of what's impacting your libido, whether that's positively or negatively. So it really, over time, kind of morphed into something that I think ultimately ended up being more robust and hopefully more helpful to people.
Yeah, yeah, which I think reminds me of this origin of the book. I mean, the origin of the story was it was going to be a low desire book originally. Its original working title was Not in the Mood, and it was going to be an inclusive book for folks who have concerns about low desire. As we started writing it, we realized that most of the people who we work with, their desire is dynamic. It's often um, being compared to a partner, and that we, collectively could think of very few folks, not to say never, but there's few folks who maybe come to see us with a desire concern who don't have a partnership to try to sort of give a barometer for where they feel like they should be. And so we realized, fairly quickly that this really needs to be more of a desire discrepancy book rather than a low desire on its own. And shockingly, there's just two, including ours, that I know of. I could be missing, something out there, but this is something that really hasn't been written a lot about. And it really has this sort of partner dynamic that's really important to weave in. And so, including some of the sort of individual things that can be going on for you. We broke the book up into, some folks might be familiar with something called a biopsychosocial model. We used Bronfenbrenner's ecological model and broke it up into different sections. So we have, all the things that might be affecting you personally, the things that might be affecting you at a socio and cultural level, the things that might be affecting you interpersonally, and how all of those things combined can have an impact on how you feel and show up in every moment, or in any particular time, how context dependent and driven that is.
Yeah, and we are not the first to use the ecological theory or the ecological systems model from Bronfenbrenner to talk about sexual health, because that's a well-established fact, for anyone who's been in this field, that different levels of culture and relationships and individual factors impact our sexual health. I don't think there's any question about that at this stage of the game. What I do think we did that I feel very proud about, because I've not really seen it in other books on this topic, is really thinking about, at the sociocultural level, ways that systemic oppression and privilege can be impactful, kind of trickle down, so to speak, to impact libido in different ways. And that's something that feels, certainly very relevant to us in our clinical work. And I know something that we both attend to as therapists, for me as a researcher as well. And we wanted to make sure that we were identifying these larger level systemic issues that impact so many of us, particularly folks with marginalized identities, folks that are within marginalized communities in multiple ways. I have not seen a book about libido that really does that. And so that's something that I feel really proud of what we've done. And I hope that that can be helpful to many people.
Yeah, I am especially proud of that. I'm also especially proud of, both of us came from the same postdoctoral training here at the University of Minnesota. And our training included training in gender care. And so we have also that particular sort of experience. Granted, mine, is probably outdated at this point because I'm a little sort of behind the times with my attending some of the conferences and things. But we really wanted to incorporate particularly trans inclusivity in this book, because so many books will say they're inclusive or they'll nod to maybe, trans and non-binary folks, but it won't really sort of hit the mark, and it'll maybe nod to it and then go back to being pretty cisnormative. And so it was really important to us to also be inclusive in terms of gender as well, and really speak to, both, trans folks, non-binary folks, and to do that in terms that don't sort of just nod to it and then go back to its cisnormative sort of tenor.
As a queer person myself, like there was no way that wasn't going to happen. We wanted to make sure that all of our siblings were represented in this within kind of the queer and trans community. And I think that we've done that. I hope that we've done that. But I think that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's something that, for folks who haven't read the book yet, there's a concept that we come back to over and over again throughout the book, which is the staircase. And again, I'm pretty open with letting people know that there's not really much that we've done here that's like just unique to us, just our voices. We've just kind of put together all of what's out there in sort of a different way and collected it. The staircase is something that we saw in a very old sexual health or sex therapy textbook.
No, a sex education book.
Was
Yeah.
it? Okay.
So this is a concept. It was an image actually that was in an old sexual health textbook, probably for high schoolers, maybe college students, from the 80s. And this is something that I had seen years and years ago with a colleague, and we had occasionally kind of talked about this and incorporated it into like conference talks and presentations we've been doing, essentially talking about how there's this very clear cis heteronormative script around how sex is supposed to go with a partner. And even if this doesn't apply to you, if you're queer, if you're trans, even if the script doesn't apply to you, you already know what it is because it's sort of culturally kind of taught to us through osmosis, just growing up in this culture and with kind of the unspoken rules of this culture around cisnormativity, heteronormativity. And it's basically sort of the script of we start with quote unquote foreplay, kind of some touching that gets more intense, maybe more genitally focused. Maybe there's some oral stimulation, but eventually the goal, quote unquote, of the top of the staircase as we sort of go upwards is to get to penile vaginal penetration. And then orgasm is kind of at the tip top of the staircase. So this is a very familiar script to most people. The staircase itself is just a different way of visually representing an ages old script that we're all familiar with. Another example of this is the baseball metaphor, right? Like first base, second base, third base. We might regionally disagree from state to state, like what second base is, but everyone knows what a home run is in that metaphor. And it's very focused on penile vaginal intercourse, very heterosexual, very cisnormative.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a nice sort of visual that we've been sharing for years now, with the people that we work with, to give something to sort of look at and to make sense of, that folks in our field have talked about for years, which is the sort of the typical script for sex. When you say, let's have sex, people just have sort of an idea of what that means. It goes from here and goes there and ends here. And that's something that so many of us, sex educators and therapists and counselors, we're trying to dismantle and, sort of tease apart how that can be harmful, how that can be creating a block for folks. And that's often something that I don't know if you would agree, it's such a fundamental shift in thinking for
For many.
people who, I mean, I've seen some folks, and I think you've told me this as well, just, sitting with us for an hour talking about the staircase, an alternative way to think of this, all the ways in which this might be creating blocks. Sometimes just that can be pretty, formative for a change.
I agree. And what I often say to clients or patients in my office is it's not that that script is bad at its core, right? Some people, that's their favorite type of sexual activity. That's the script that they really love and hold dear. So it's not that it's at its core a negative or a bad thing. The problem really lies in the fact that we become too rigid with the sexual staircase script, right? And folks that are in sexual partnerships that struggle to get out of that rigidity and they struggle to think about other ways to find pleasure and other ways to be sexual, they really struggle. They really, really struggle. And this is something that has been well established in the field of sexual health and sex therapy. Flexibility, adaptability are key, right? If you're not able to be flexible around your sexual activities and your sexual script, something's going to happen to create a challenge. Whether in my world, that's usually a medical illness or a disease like cancer, something like that, that really changes things for folks. But that really could be anything. Right? That really kind of pushes us out of that script in a positive way, or we become stuck and really don't know how to move.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, I do so much relationship and couples therapy that I'm constantly talking to folks about how that script becomes so all or none in partnerships. And so if your idea of sex is just this, prescribed, linear, hierarchical kind of experience, and let's say you don't have the time, the energy, the interest, or you don't experience pleasure from any part of that, what happens for some folks, typically the person who identifies as lower libido in the partnership, but not always, those folks might be saying, hey, I don't want to touch or engage because if I start kissing, touching, caressing, it might give my partner the impression that I want to ascend the whole staircase. And if I'm not interested or up for that, then what happens is over time, that partner may say, you know what, I'm just not going to engage. I'm not going to touch. I'm not going to kiss. And so slowly what happens is there is less and less physical contact. There's less and less sexual intimacy because now it's sort of held hostage to this. It's either the whole staircase or don't even get started.
I agree. And so we present in Desire, without giving too much away for those that haven't read yet, we present an alternative model for how to move away from this kind of rigid staircase thinking, as we refer to it as, how you start to really ascertain for yourself and within your relationships what that could potentially look like and where there might be helpful middle ground, right? So a lot of folks are not feeling interested in doing kind of the full traditional staircase script sexually with their partners, but there might be some other things that they really love doing and find a lot of pleasure in and find a lot of enjoyment in. And guess what? Engaging in those things actually can really improve and increase your desire over time. So we want to move out of that all or nothing thinking. And so we introduce what's called the wheel model in the book to really kind of showcase ways that we can move away from staircase thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is huge. And it takes time because I work with this every day. I co-authored this book with you on it. And I still have this sense of like sex is that staircase because it's so insidious, it's so ingrained, and it's constantly reinforced in the media that we consume. And so I think it's going to be sort of a lifelong challenging the staircase and trying to sort of reorient thinking because it's not like we've departed from those waters that we, swim in that reinforce the staircase. We're still immersed in the same culture that shows us this is what sex looks like. And so some people will come in and see me and say, it's so frustrating because we've been doing some of this work but yet I still feel like it's, supposed to end in this, or I feel bad, or, the all or none. And it's just this constant sort of gentle reinforcement that this is going to take time, because it is the default that most of us have just, been both taught and internalized.
I agree completely. And I think a big piece of this work at a larger level for any of us, all of us, really is how do we kind of unearth and deal with that internalized heteronormativity, cisnormativity? How do we get out of that internalized process for ourselves? Those are bigger level and often lifelong processes, right? We don't always reach a level where we're like, okay, check, we've gotten rid of all of our internalized biases. This is one particular way where those internalized biases show up in the bedroom, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully, I've already gotten some, private messages from folks who have, got the book right away and got to reading really quickly, and just talking about how helpful some of the information that we share is around some of these models, like the staircase or the wheel. One of the other things that we talk about in particular that's not our, thought baby, but it is something that we really bring home, is the different types of desire, and how important it is to know that there's not just one way to experience desire. That's what leaves so many people feeling like something's wrong with them. The type of desire that we see in the movies and television is that spontaneous desire. That's what we think is desire, but it's not always the case.
And that certainly might be the type of desire that one person experiences or one partner in a relationship experiences. But chances are it's not always going to be that way for all partners in the relationship. Responsive sexual desire, responsive libido, which is the other type that we spend quite a bit of time talking about, actually becomes really, really important. And for some people, they switch styles, particularly as they get older, when there are physical changes, hormonal changes. They might switch from a more spontaneous to a more responsive style of desire or style of libido. For other people, they've just always been more of one or the other. And there's nothing wrong with any of those scenarios. But when we live in a culture that only shows us this sort of lightning bolt, spontaneous sexual desire, all of a sudden somebody's horny, and then, in the movies and shows we watch, they have very unrealistic sexual experiences on screen. That is not the case for so many people in our world. And if you've been somebody who's always been more responsive in sexual desire, what I often hear is that they walk away from those kind of cultural experiences with movies and shows and books feeling like something's wrong with them, feeling broken, feeling as if they're not good enough or there's something wrong with their sexuality, when the reality is they're not. They're not broken. There's nothing particularly wrong per se. It's just a different style of desire, and one that doesn't have to be a deal breaker if one partner is more spontaneous and another is more responsive. But we do have to figure out how to navigate that difference, because it is a difference.
And I would say in my work, it is utterly common to see one partner who has more spontaneous desire and one partner who has more responsive. And thus, how do we navigate that? Because they're not the same. And I would argue too that you could have two folks who are responsive or two folks who are more spontaneous leaning and still have differences, because even within those categories, there's a lot of variation. For folks who are not familiar with what responsive desire means, you're probably familiar with the idea of spontaneous desire. It's just like, poof, you're just horny and ready to go, and it just comes out of nowhere or comes on abruptly. Responsive desire is something that Rosemary Basson talked about. She's one of our colleagues, researchers, back in, I think she published about this in the late 90s, early aughts. And had this sort of nonlinear model of sexual desire. And what that just means is that rather than having, desire come first, and then you go through the rest of, the sexual response cycle, that for many, it's more like something that is physically arousing or stimulating, something that, is visually stimulating, something that, some sort of sensation gets sparked. And from that sensation, desire emerges. And so it's often sort of seen as like maybe after something arousing or appealing is happening. And that seems to resonate for so many people, and yet doesn't often get talked about out in the general public. And, sex educators, therapists, counselors, we, are very familiar with this. It's talked about a lot. But when we talk to the folks that we serve, it's new information. And that's another sort of reason why we had this mission to write this book, because that we don't want that to be something that everyone's discovering later in life. We want people to have that information, sooner.
For sure. And with responsive desire, I mean, the desire is responding to body arousal. That's maybe another way to think about it. And that also raises so many questions for people. What helps your body get aroused? What helps with that physiological arousal before you kind of mentally are like, oh, yeah, I'm really here for that. Like, I'm into it. Like, glad we're here. Let's keep going. That responsive desire, that might be somebody's predominant style of desire, but they also might not know what are the things that helps my body get going to kind of create responsive desire. And so that might be a whole kind of learning task in and of itself. What helps my body get there so my mind can follow soon after.
Yeah. Brings up, what do I enjoy? What arouses me? What brings me pleasure? Not just sexually, but, sort of as a whole sort of category. And those are things that we also touch on in the book, because there are so many of us who have not really had a lot of support or opportunity to take a step back and say, hey, how much permission do I give myself to have pleasurable experiences, sexual and non-sexual? And, again, how do we navigate those differences if my partner, really enjoys this and I enjoy that, or what have you. And, one of the other things that we really talk about is how, nobody in a partnership is the problem. This is about, a spectrum of human sexuality. Everyone has sort of their own individual needs and differences and preferences and desires. And it's just like, I think, the Hollywood version is to sort of make everything match up and to, completely close any gaps. And the reality is that's often not a realistic expectation, because that's removing some of the individual difference in partnerships. And so it's more like, how do we honor and understand, each person's sexuality, rather than trying to match it to or meet some external barometer.
Taking that a step further, I'm recalling as you were talking, Lauren, about how, part of a book is watching your language and really trying to be as concise and specific as possible to get across the ideas you're trying to convey to readers and to the audience. We fairly quickly along the way decided to boot the term mismatched. And so that's a term that neither of us use anymore. I know I'm certainly very intentional about not using that language. I'm not sure that I ever did a ton, but we often hear kind of in our culture and sometimes in the world of sexual health, mismatched libidos, mismatched desires. And we very purposely have moved away from that, because the underlying implication there is that you're going to match and you should match. When we know that that's not true for a huge amount of couples, a huge amount of partnerships, a huge amount of relationships. And certainly if there ever was a point where you did match, quote unquote, it's not going to stay that way for the duration of your relationship. And that doesn't mean something's wrong necessarily. It is a predictable, normal part of being in relationships, especially long-term relationships. And so we've really been thoughtful about the language that we use to try to get away from some of these stereotypes and some of these assumptions that I think we're not doing a good enough job sort of interrogating as a field.
Yeah, yeah. I think our original subtitle back when we were pitching it had mismatched libidos or
Yeah.
desire in there. And it was, when we really started to be intentional to write, to think about this, we're like, wait a minute, what's matched libido? Because even if you're fairly similar in desire to a partner, there's going to be a time somewhere where you might have desire and your partner doesn't. And so I think really to further dismantle this idea of matched is maybe unrealistic for most. For some, it's completely unrealistic, and it's at least not realistic across time. So we're ditching mismatched libidos here.
Everyone's on notice. We're dissing that. We're dissing
we
that
have
term.
we have called on the community to use different language, because I think it sets people up for pause and alarm.
Mhm.
Because if you have this message out there that you should have matched libidos, and that's what equates to a healthy sexual relationship or a secure relationship, that's really setting a lot of people up to be alarmed when there's no need to be.
And feeling like failures when they're not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's another sort of key concept that really stood out, is just the language that we use. The staircase, and the wheel, and responsive and spontaneous, and then just it's their differences, and they're expected, and they're normative.
And that for the vast majority of folks, this is a relationship issue. This is a relationship concern, might even be too strong of a word, but a relationship dynamic that deserves addressing and deserves a paying attention to, not because any one person in that relationship is bad or wrong or broken.
Yeah, I think because there's been so much written about low libido, there are so many books for low libido folks, which that's not a problem in and of itself. But the number of low libido books compared to like higher libido folks, or um, books that are written for partners of, like, if the higher libido partner are, I can't even think of one. Um,
No.
no, yeah, yeah, that's what I thought. So, just having such a predominance of articles and writing and research about low libido really has historically framed that partner, whoever that is in the dynamic, as the problem, because there's books to sort of fix that, or at least the person reading it is thinking that's what we're going to do when we read this book, is like fix my libido, try to match it to my higher libido partner. And so there's definitely been a message, if not implicit, it's been explicit, that the lower libido folks are the ones who need to do the work. And so still to this day, they are the folks who are reaching out to us. They are the folks who are coming in for therapy, and often alone, saying, I have low libido, my partner's distressed about this, I need to fix it. And I think that over time, this is starting to shift my clinical practice, because we're seeing this more and more as a relational dynamic. Neither's right or wrong, but we need to navigate it. And what's more helpful, if we can make it work, is to have all partners involved in that conversation. Because otherwise, even just the setup of having like the lower libido folks go read books and go to therapy is just perpetuating the very cycle that we're trying to disrupt. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so readers will find that we specifically address, in fact, dedicated a single entire chapter to, if you're the person in your relationship who identifies as the higher libido partner, what is that like for you? And what are some strategies for you to be considering, right? Within the overall message that we hope to convey, that this is a relational issue, this is a relationship concern, not any one person's problem, quote unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and for anybody who's watching us, who is in the field, this is something that I think is so important, and I hope to see more of a cultural shift in how we talk about this and how we work with it. That bringing both or all partners into the room to have this conversation, I think, is just I think it really sort of helps speak to the issue where the issue lies, right? This is a how do we navigate our differences, not one person has deficient libido that needs to be corrected. Because there is no libido measure. There's no like you're, right where you should be. It's all relative to sort of what you want and need, and then how that presents in your partnership.
Even that language of high and low, we struggled with for a time how we wanted to navigate that in writing this book, because those very terms themselves imply a referent, right? Who are you low compared to? Who are you high compared to? Sometimes and often I would say in our clinical world, that's a partner, right? So I'm low compared to my partner, I'm high compared to my partner. But it's actually a really important question to be asking of folks when they have libido concerns. Are you thinking low compared to your past self, low compared to what you think you should be experiencing, high compared to your past self, high compared to the sort of idealized self, high compared to a partner? Who is the referent here? And that actually is really important to understand in having discussions about desire.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it also, just sort of wrap up here before I think we're going to take some questions.
Mhm.
Um, but it also sort of speaks to something we talk about in um, the sociocultural section, where we're looking at a concept called compulsory sexuality, which is sort of embedded in some of these conversations. People may not have that language, but that comes from, I think it was an essay by Adrienne Rich.
Yes, yeah. Mhm.
And it was originally about compulsory heterosexuality. Really, this is just speaking to sort of the messaging that we get in our culture, right? And we sort of get this bifurcated message that's really confusing because, on the one hand, don't have too low libido because that's not good. But if you're too high, then you've got a problem. And so we're looking for some sort of Goldilocks effect in people's libidos. But there's so much more messaging that says you should be having sex with your partners. You should be having sex at a certain frequency. You should be doing certain things when you're having sex. And um, there's such a lack of messaging that says you can be in a really healthy, secure relationship and not have sex, have infrequent sex, have sex that looks like this or that. Those messages I don't think are as pervasive. And so our hope or aim is that some of the message from this book is to let folks know that, it's really, um, individualized, and it depends on the partnership. And you can have a beautiful relationship and never have sex. You can have a beautiful relationship and have sex a few times a year. It really depends on what works for everyone involved. Yeah,
I think it's time for us to turn to Q&A. I'm keeping an eye
I
on
think
the time
so.
here. And I want to encourage folks, if you have questions about any part of this, our writing process, the book itself, please send in questions into the chat.
Yeah. So I think we will start gathering some questions. If you have one, add that in. And then I think in a few moments here, we'll have someone join us. Here's our lovely moderator.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been really interesting listening to you, especially talk about your process for writing the book. Writing the book together. So I've got a few questions that have come in. The first is, why were you focused on libido and desire within relationships specifically? Because obviously those exist in people on their own.
This is the number one thing that people come to sex therapy for. Certainly, there are lots of reasons people seek out sexual health care and sex therapy. This is sort of the number one complaint that sex therapists see is, I am partnered with somebody and our libidos don't align, they don't match. Again, kind of that language that we talked about that we're moving away from. But this is the number one complaint that we see in the sex therapy world. And so that is one of the major reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's sort of how it emerged over time. And I won't say in all cases, certainly folks who are exploring sexual orientation or their own individual sexuality, certainly come in. But so often you know, it seems to be that if you are experiencing a period of low desire, or you just don't have much sexual desire, if you don't have a partnership and a context like that to navigate that within, there are so many people who are just like, I'm just not feeling that sexual. So, like, I'm good, and might sort of operate accordingly. Whereas when that is within a partnership, especially where there's a partner to sort of refer to and reference against, that's where it can create some, challenges. And particularly, we hear so many people who will say, like, I don't care if I ever have sex again. Like, I'm good. It's not okay with my partner, and it's creating conflict for us. And so that's, a huge part of why we wrote it as more relational and dynamic, because there's lots of folks who say, I'm okay not doing this for a while, or doing it at whatever frequency works for me, or having the libido that I do, but here's where it's causing distress.
That actually transitions perfectly into the next question, which is from one of our watchers. Where does asexuality fit in a book about desires? About desire.
Yeah, great question. Um, Lauren and I were actually talking a little bit before we jumped on camera here about this very topic. And really, that in our experience, and just clinically, a lot of folks find their asexuality and kind of come to that identity through conversations and considerations about desire. And so that is something we talk specifically about in the book. We absolutely wanted to make sure that we were addressing ace spectrum folks, and that many people in our experience clinically kind of come to those identities and come to that understanding of themselves, sometimes through these distressing interactions with partners.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that that's how some people come to realize their asexual or aspectrum identity, and yet it is a common one. And we seem to see libido and asexuality. They have a relationship. Some people see them as the same. That my low desire means that I'm asexual. Some people see those as entirely separate. I definitely think, as we were sort of talking before we came on, we could write a whole book on how to sort of navigate the differences between, desire, libido, sexual orientation. So we very, sort of minimal scratch the surface here about that, but we do, have that in our consideration. We do mention it, and what a lot of folks who are not asexual may not realize, but folks in the ace community do, is that if you have an asexual identity, does not necessarily mean that you do not have a sexual relationship. And so how do you navigate, being in a partnership, maybe with an allosexual person and a more aspec person? I think this book speaks to those folks as well.
Thanks so much. That actually, again, transitions nicely to the next question, which is, um, you mentioned that you could write a whole nother book about specifically about desire versus libido versus sexual orientation. Are there concepts that you would have liked to explore more, or that you would want to see explored more, that you didn't get a chance to touch on as much in the book? And are connected to this, are there concepts that you couldn't explore because there haven't hasn't been enough research in that, and that, like, where would you like to see things go from there?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. We certainly acknowledge that, this did not end up being the end all be all list around factors that influence libido, because the reality of that is literally anything has the potential to affect your libido positively or negatively. So it can never sort of be absolutely 100% comprehensive. We do acknowledge that there are some things that we left out of the book. One of the biggest ones that comes to my mind is sort of the intersection of substance use, any concerns with kind of chemical dependency. That's something that shows up a lot kind of in the mental health world, that can have different impacts on libido depending on the person, depending on kind of what we're talking about within that dynamic. That's not something that we spent a lot of time on, in part because there's not a ton of research on that. Certainly a lot of research on substance and chemical use and sexuality at large, but even that is really, really lacking. And so to talk specifically about impacts with libido slash desire, within that dynamic would have been really difficult. We would have had very limited information to pull from.
Yeah, yeah. And going back to the question about asexuality, I mean, think, so by the time a book publishes, there's been some time between the last time you worked on it and the time that it published, and that was over a year for us. And so I would love, and we've talked about it. I mean, who knows? We'll actually do this. We're not promising anything, but if we ever got the chance to do a revised or an updated edition at some point in the future, I would love to spend more time talking about that very thing. There are already really great existing books about asexuality, so we don't want to sort of take up space in a space that already has some really great writing about it, especially from by authors and from folks who are in the community. But I do think there is this sort of, again, intersection between libido and asexuality, and how do you navigate the difference between those? Because sometimes they can look very similar. And I would love to do more expanding on that if we get the chance to. If not in a future, revised edition, then maybe through some of the workshops and trainings that we're planning to do over the next few years.
I would add to that even though there were topics where either there wasn't enough research to expand upon, or like we very logistically had like a word count limit that we had to bump up against, that is actually a thing. We tried really, really hard. There's a pretty extensive resources section in the back of this book. So we tried really, really hard to make sure that we could include books, podcasts, other sorts of resources for topics that we didn't necessarily spend tons and tons and tons of time on.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's a really comprehensive answer. The next question is, you make a really strong point to say partners with with parentheses around the S, so multiple partners being potentially included. Did you get to a chance to explore the way desire differences play out in non-traditional relationships, particularly when it comes to polyamory or ethical non-monogamy, and what kind of difference that might make for people with desire differences?
Yes, thank you for noticing. That tells me we have a very well-educated and well-rounded audience here. So I appreciate folks noticing that language. We absolutely talk about ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. We use the term ethical non-monogamy in desire. That is brought up. It's brought up both to kind of talk about what that looks like around libido and desire, but also as for some people a potential avenue for exploring differences in desire. That is certainly not for everybody, and we acknowledge that very, very clearly. But we talk about that as one of many options to potentially consider or explore or start talking about with partners.
And I think it really depends on the partnership too. And this is where being able to work with folks like one-on-one or, with relationships in the room is a little different than, when we're speaking to a broader audience, because there are some folks for whom this, would not be a recommendation based on some of the relational dynamics or the state that the relationship might be in. However, it is something that a lot of folks consider or turn to, and we thought it was really important to include that here because speaking as mainly a sex and relationship therapist, that's my sort of whole hat. I see folks in non-monogamous dynamics all the time. And so some of it is because of some of these desire differences. Some of it is to navigate, some other desires or interests. Some of it is, there's a whole host of things that can bring people to ethical non-monogamy. But it was really important to us to also have that included here because we didn't want to miss an opportunity to, invite folks in the community into this conversation. Because it's something that can impact dynamics across relationship structures.
And to educate folks that might not be familiar with ethical non-monogamy, even though that is becoming more acceptable in our culture and certainly more common in our culture these days, there's still a lot of people that have a lot of misconceptions about what ethical non-monogamy is and what that can potentially look like.
Right. So this is a question from me, actually, thinking about desire and attraction and recognizing that those are two different things, that people can have desire that isn't directed towards anyone specifically, and people can be attracted without feeling a desire to act on it. How would you address that, especially when it comes to a relationship where you would hope that the desire would be directed towards another person in that relationship?
Yeah, sometimes it's not, right? This is perhaps where we reach the point of maybe we move beyond the book as being kind of the thing that's going to really give us an idea about moving forward. We think about this book as a starting place and we talk about it as foundational information because we think that's true, right? We wrote this book as, information you would get from us in like a first session, maybe 2, 3 sessions, as certified sex therapists, as couples and relationship therapists. Um, and we also include a whole section in the book about when you might need additional support, right? And if we have somebody who has desire, but it's not for the person or persons that they're partnered with, well, that might be a place where we need some additional care. We might need to be working with a relationship therapist and or a sex therapist to kind of navigate what that means for them moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. I think where we do include a little bit of this in the book is around motivators for sex, and this may speak for some folks and not for others, um, but that there are many different motivations for sex, and feeling attraction to a partner is just one of maybe many different motivators. Feeling pleasure, expressing, care. There can be just, dozens and dozens of reasons. And so for some people, just knowing that can be helpful to know that, okay, like even if I don't have this really strong sexual attraction, that may or may not be a deal breaker. For others, it is. And it goes back to sort of individual difference, but we do sort of include this part around, motivation. And there's lots of different reasons that people come together and have partnered sexual experiences.
Over 200 documented.
Wow. So here's another question. Can you talk specifically about libido after the after 40s? Someone mentions that for some people there's a spike and for others it changes, and especially that it's frequently not talked about. For it's frequently not talked about for people older than their 40s.
Yeah, I will kind of grab this one up front because I'm primarily located in a menopause and sexual health clinic. A lot of the people that I'm having these conversations with are cisgender women of all sexual orientations, but cisgender women who are going through perimenopause or postmenopause. And we know that that can, because of some of the hormonal implications, that can change spontaneous libido for some people. The complicated piece here, right? Because it's always complicated with human sexuality, is that's not true for everybody. So there is this sort of generalized prediction of less spontaneous desire after menopause, and with that hormonal change. But other people, it's totally the opposite, right? They might finally feel like, oh my gosh, I'm free. I don't have to worry about like unwanted pregnancies. Like there's so much of a relief around that change in a positive direction that it actually can spike spontaneous desire. And that really, I think, is one of the biggest illustrations for me of how it depends on the person, right? To say like hormones are the end all be all in our level of spontaneous desire is lazy, and the science doesn't back that either, right? And so I'm always a little perturbed when I hear people being like, it's just your hormones, it's all about the hormones. Hormones definitely play a role in our spontaneous desire, we know that, but is by no means the only factor, right? These psychological factors, these social factors, relational factors all come into play. And so those things still need to be addressed at whatever age you are and whatever your hormone status looks like.
And I think, to add to this, so many folks, along the lines of like not having great sex ed to begin with, so many of us are not prepared for the fact that our sexuality will change over time. And so, even if your desire style doesn't change, what feels good might change, what kind of aids or things that you might need to sort of supplement to make the experience more pleasurable, right? Maybe you didn't need lubrication, now you do. Maybe you didn't, need different types of stimulation, and now you really do need that in order to have an orgasm. So it's really kind of working with our changing bodies and expecting that they'll change, and knowing that one thing may not work over a lifespan. And so going back to flexibility really being so important in the lifespan of our sexual health.
And in many ways, I would say that trumps whatever the hormones or the biology is doing, right? Because it allows us to work with whatever the biology is doing.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything that either of you want to add as we wrap things up about your work, about the book, about anything else that you want to promote?
Lauren?
I was just going to say, I mean, this is our main sort of project as of right now. We are pretty active on social media, and so if folks want to, keep up with what we're doing, future events, anything that we're sort of working on in the future, feel free to follow us along. And you can find us on, both of us are on Instagram. I also have Facebook, TikTok. So you can find us if you want to follow our work.
And I would just add thank you to everyone who's been such a huge support. We knew that this topic in this book was needed, but wow, was it ever really needed based on some of the feedback we're getting? And so we're so appreciative of everyone who has sent us feedback. And sometimes that's feedback of like, did we miss something? And we're open to that too, right? So with the thought process that there might someday be an updated edition or a second version, if there's stuff we've missed, we're definitely open to hearing that too.
Because we know we did. I mean, you just can't cover the entire, like you said, the entire, breadth of this topic.
All right. I want to thank you both so much for joining us and so much for writing this really incredible guide. It's amazingly, as much as both of you keep saying that you didn't include a lot of things, it really is so overwhelmingly informative and comprehensive. So I want to encourage folks to pick it up where you can. We do have signed copies at Busboys and Poets Tacoma, and shortly we'll have them at other Busboys and Poets locations as well. And thank you all so much for joining us. You can also get a copy of the book at your local indie bookstore or from bookshop.org. We encourage you to support independent bookstores.
Mhm.
And thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.